Well, as Europe regroups in the wake of the fiery clash between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, there are questions over what to do with Russia's frozen assets. Roughly $300 billion in Russian hard currency reserves are being held in Western banks, mostly in Europe, and Ukraine has received loans covered by the interest generated to help fight the war. Could these assets go further? Joining us now is Anton Moiseyenko, a senior lecturer in law at the Australian National University, whose work focuses on the legal and policy aspects of economic sanctions. Anton, thank you for joining us. Now, we're not talking about yachts and private jets here. What are these frozen assets?
That's right, and thank you for having me, Gemma. In the aftermath of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, literally 2 days after the invasion took place, Western nations, so the United States, the European Union, Japan, Australia, froze essentially 2 categories of Russian assets. Private property that belongs to oligarchs and top Russian officials, so those are the yachts, mansions that have then made their way into popular press and politicians have focused on. But the more important category by far is the approximately 300 to 350 billion in frozen Russian foreign currency reserves that belong directly to the central bank of Russia, that's to say to the Russian state. And if we just think about the amounts involved, the total amount of assistance provided to Ukraine by the European Union over these 3 years is 100-odd-something billion euros. The United States is trailing not far behind with approximately 100 billion. So if those 300 billion of foreign currency reserves were in fact transferred to Ukraine, that would dwarf the combined amount of US and EU support so far.
So that question about whether the assets could go further there, that's caused tensions between the UK and France at this week's summit. Can you tell me about that?
There has been a divergence of opinion among EU member states and arguably some of the other partners of the sanctions coalition for some time. Everyone agrees fundamentally that those assets should remain frozen unless and until Russia complies with its obligation to pay reparations to Ukraine. And the reality is that given the damage inflicted on Ukraine, the reparations that are in order are likely to far exceed even that amount of 300 to 350 billion. But where there hasn't been that unity is the question of whether EU and other nations can act unilaterally without any agreement from Russia and take those frozen assets and in fact transfer them to Ukraine and say, well, now we are giving those assets to you because Russia is not complying with its obligation to pay reparations. France has been somewhat, or not of a laggard, but one of the countries that perhaps have been less enthused by this idea based on public reporting, whereas some of the other countries like the UK and indeed the United States in the past under the Biden administration have been much more receptive to that notion of transferring frozen assets.
And with the Trump administration refusing to blame Russia for the war and considering easing of sanctions, will that have an effect on the 2/3 of these assets that are controlled by the EU?
Yes, indirectly. So as you said, we have this total amount of, let's say, 300 billion. Approximately 200 billion in those central bank reserves is held at Euroclear, which is a securities clearinghouse based in Belgium. And so Belgium, or by extension the EU, have custody over those assets. The United States therefore can't say, okay, Russia, you can have back this property. That's not within the gift of the Trump administration. But here's the catch. The sanctions imposed by the EU are not adopted in perpetuity. Instead, they need to be extended every 6 months, and that requires agreement from all 27 members of the Union, including Hungary and Slovakia, which have been growing increasingly recalcitrant when it comes to imposing any sanctions on Russia. And so one ramification of the Trump rhetoric is that the United States might embolden those countries within the EU to say, not interested. We don't want to extend those sanctions against Russia. And then not only will the assets not be transferred to Ukraine and reparations not be paid, but in fact the freezing will simply not be extended and those assets will by default go back to Russia.
Anton Moiseyenko, senior lecturer in law at the Australian National University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.